a brilliant, free-spirited college student.
Barbara was very creative. She was always very theatrical.
I always thought she was a genius because everything came so easy to her.
Is found brutally murdered in a mountain canyon.
We could see 5 or 6 gunshot wounds.
There was some speculations that she had been sexually assaulted.
A clue left by the victim leads to surprising suspects.
He finds this note addressed to all the Mormon roommates that she was leaving to go be with her people.
Just how bad was this relationship with her roommates, and what could it cause anyone to do?
And a series of bizarre twists.
He's telling us that bullet holes were in a triangular pattern, and that's a sign of a possible Satan killing.
Somebody took her up there into the woods. This was potentially a sacrifice.
Until the evidence reveals a killer no one saw coming.
There was DNA from the soil that was underneath her body.
It was like finding a needle in a haystack, a big haystack.
It just didn't seem like somebody who would kill somebody.
It was just the biggest shock you could fathom.
Provo, Utah, a small college town in a picture-perfect mountain setting.
Provo sits in a county south of Salt Lake. It's where the Brigham Young University campus is at.
It's a very safe community. During the 1970s, Provo was definitely a place that was very low on crime, and you didn't have to worry about locking your doors at night.
That innocence is lost on a cold March afternoon in 1974, when a grisly discovery in a nearby canyon sends shockwaves through the community.
On March 11th, 1974, the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office received a telephone call from a power company worker who started walking up from the power plant. And as he was cutting through some brush, he came across a white female with gunshot wounds to her back.
The crime scene is essentially a couple miles up what we call Big Cottonwood Canyon.
Investigators race to the canyon where the utility worker leads them to the body.
We could see 5 or 6 gunshot wounds. All of them looked to be in her back or in her arm. The shot placements looked like execution-type shots, and it looked like she had been there for a few hours at least. With the way that her body was positioned, we felt like sexual assault was part of this crime scene. Her arms were tucked up underneath her. That told us that she was in pain, that she was fearful of what was happening to her. We're looking for things like drag marks, but the ground around the body was not disturbed.
It looks like where she was is where she was killed.
Detectives are struck by an unusual detail.
Her clothes were folded neatly and piled towards the top of her head.
We suspected that the victim was probably trying to buy some time. As she was being told to undress, she was stacking her clothes in this neat pile.
More evidence is revealed when they turn the victim over.
We found some possibly .38 caliber bullets that were recovered after they had gone through the victim's body. We also picked up some soil and logged it into our evidence room.
The detectives back in the 70s, they didn't have the DNA that we have in today's crime scene investigations. They focused on all kinds of trace evidence like the soil, fibers, hairs may link the suspect to that scene.
While the body is taken to the morgue, detectives interview their only witness.
The only thing we really knew at this point was a utility worker had found this body, and we were able to clear him fairly quickly, but we didn't know who the victim was. We didn't have any other real suspects to go with at that point. We got a hold of the local media, let them know that we had a white female, Jane Doe, that we were trying to identify. Later that night, we received a telephone call from the Brigham Young University Police Department that they had received a missing person report of a white female earlier that day. The missing person in Provo matched the description of our Jane Doe.
The missing person is 22-year-old student Barbara Jean Rocky, but police need a formal identification to be sure she's also their murder victim.
We made a phone call down to a couple of the guys that were hanging out with Barbara.
Jerry Hicker is the one that filed the missing persons report. Jerry is also a student at BYU, and he was a friend of Barbara's and some of her roommates.
Edward Fisher and Jerry Hicker went to the morgue to do an identification on our Jane Doe.
Edward and Jerry confirm the murdered woman is Barbara Rocky. Police now face the difficult task of informing her family.
At the time of Barbara's murder, my parents were living in California.
My mom found out first from the police and was crying, and from then on, nothing was the same.
It was just the biggest shock you could fathom. It's like what you knew of the world has just imploded.
Born in 1952, Barbara had an idyllic childhood growing up in Menlo Park, California.
Barbara was very creative. She was always very theatrical.
I always thought she was a genius because languages and music came so easy to her. Barbara was always rooting for the underdog. If somebody needed help, she would open doors for them. I mean, always doing something very sweet.
When the time came to go to college, Barbara's choice reflected a growing spiritual interest.
Barbara was always searching for a religion.
Barbara was interested in the Mormon religion. My parents were very happy for her to go to Brigham Young because they felt that she would get the safe group of friends and the good education and religion that she required.
When Barbara went off to college, she seemed up and happy and like things were going well.
Investigators asked Barbara's loved ones if they can think of anyone who might be responsible.
Since she was away at college and out of our supervision, we had no idea what she was doing. We just didn't know what kind of friends she was making.
In speaking with the family, they just had no idea on who could have done this to her.
With the family unable to provide leads, detectives hope her college friends might be able to point them in the right direction.
Ed Fisher was dating one of Barbara's roommates. When asked if he had any idea who would have done this to Barbara, he just had no idea. He felt Jerry Hicker might have more information about Barbara than he would.
Jerry Hicker is also a student at BYU, and Barbara seemed to spend lots of time with him.
Jerry described that he was just devastated that this had happened to Barbara. He knew Barbara very well.
Police asked Jerry what led him to file a missing persons report just hours before Barbara was found dead.
He said that he had gone skiing the day before, used Barbara's car to take the skis back, and then he met up with Barbara on March 11th at about 10 o'clock in the morning and gave the car keys back with plans to meet up later on to go grocery shopping. After leaving Barbara, Jerry spoke with one of Barbara's roommates, and then he went to study at the library. Later that day, Jerry and Barbara had plans to grab some food, but she didn't show up. As Jerry left the BYU campus, he walked past Barbara's house and he didn't see Barbara's car, so he continued towards his home. And as he was passing the Park Plaza apartments and sees Barbara's car sitting in the parking lot, which was someplace that Barbara would have never parked her car.
He said that was kind of odd, why it would have been parked where it's not normally parked.
Inside the car, he finds this note that was left by Barbara. It's addressed to all the roommates that basically said that she had found her people, that she was leaving to go be with her people. I think that he looked at it as a suicide note, and so he took the note over to the roommates, and that raised enough suspicion to report her as a missing person.
In order to clear Jerry as a person of interest, detectives drilled deeper into his timeline.
Jerry gave his timeline up until that evening, and essentially once he found that letter, he came and talked to us.
Jerry reported her missing, he found the note, he was cooperating with detectives, so he really wasn't somebody that fit as a suspect.
When detectives ask Jerry about any conflicts Barbara may have had, he mentions one unexpected source.
Jerry tells investigators that the roommates and Barbara kind of have an off-again, on-again relationship.
Barbara Jean Rocky lived with 7 other women from Mormon families. Barbara sometimes liked to do things for shock value, and this is not a place people go to shock others.
There was a little bit of intimidation between Barbara and some of the girls. Jerry said that things had gotten so bad that he had tried to find Barbara another place to live.
Was it possible one of Barbara's roommates could be the culprit behind her death?
Just how bad was this relationship that Barbara Jean Rocky had with her roommates, and what could it cause anyone to do?
Coming up, detectives uncover dark secrets.
The majority of the roommates were very religious.
He had a relationship with Barbara Jean and had been dating one of her roommates.
A love triangle could easily turn deadly when there's jealousy involved.
He had pulled a dagger on her and said he was going to stab her.
And links to a terrifying killer.
She described him as a great warlock and maybe even a devil worshiper.
There's women all over the American West that are going missing and being discovered dead.
This guy turns out to be probably the most famous, notorious serial killer of all time.
Until the evidence reveals the horrific truth.
He was not who we suspected, and so to learn that he was responsible for killing her was very surprising.
After 22-year-old college student Barbara Rocky is found shot dead, police have discovered she had clashed with her roommates and bring them in separately for questioning.
The roommates had only known her since January when Barbara moved into the house, and going to their predominantly Mormon school, Barbara really didn't fit that mold. She was from California and she was more of a free spirit.
She was somebody who was very opinionated and was not a conformist.
Barbara Jean Rocky's roommates say that she was kind of dating around, not necessarily saving herself from marriage, and it was generally not accepted.
The roommates were very religious. They attended church faithfully. I think Barbara would probably experiment with different religions just to expand her knowledge, and at times would do things that would maybe scare them.
Barbara Jean's roommate said she was kind of into witchcraft, so she was attracted to that lifestyle a little bit.
They didn't want to be a part of Barbara's life, so they would keep her at arm's length.
Had one of Barbara's roommates lashed out and done something unthinkable?
Being more of the typical LDS BYU student, you just wouldn't think that somebody like that could kill somebody. But until you do the leather work on it, you can't clear them.
Detectives work to verify the roommates' alibis.
Once the investigators corroborated all the stories and looked at the timelines, they were able to clear the roommates as not being somebody that had killed Barbara.
As detectives continue asking the roommates about Barbara, they learn some startling new information.
Investigators found out through the interviews of the roommates that Barbara would carry a .357 revolver pistol. Some of the roommates described Barbara as being maybe a little bit paranoid, where she would think people were following her.
In 1974, people weren't just walking around with guns the way they do today. So if a 21-year-old college kid was walking around with a .357 Magnum pistol, who was she afraid of?
Detectives get more surprises when they search Barbara's vehicle.
When the investigators looked in the rear of the vehicle and they found ammunition and targets, things that you wouldn't expect in a female BYU student's car. Did Barbara feel like she needed to have a gun? Did she practice with the gun? Was somebody after her? We weren't sure what all of that meant at that point. The car was fingerprinted, but there was just nothing of good forensic value that we could come up with at that time.
With more questions than answers, detectives turn their attention back to the note Barbara's friend Jerry had found earlier in Barbara's car.
They found a victim, shot multiple times, and then someone else finds this note in her car that says she's leaving to be with her people. And what's the purpose of this?
The investigators were wondering if the note was even authored by Barbara, so they do some handwriting analysis on it and send it out to have that done.
While detectives await results, the autopsy report comes in.
At that time, they came up with 6 bullet hole entrance wounds. The shot in the arm was probably the bullet that killed her because it went back into the chest and hit some vital organs. And the final wounds were when Barbara was turned over and on her stomach, and the entrance wounds were in her back.
Being shot in the back is a good indicator that the person is known by the assailant. He doesn't want to see their face when he kills them.
At the autopsy, the medical examiner took swabs of both her rectum and her vaginal area to try to preserve any evidence that might be there.
The autopsy report indicated no definitive evidence that she had been sexually assaulted.
With the autopsy offering no new leads, investigators turn their focus to any romantic relationships Barbara may have had.
They were talking with the roommates more about other men that may be in Barbara's life, and they came up with a guy named Richard. They knew that Barbara was very much infatuated with him. She spoke about him all the time, even called him her boyfriend.
As police focus on Richard, they make a disturbing discovery.
They had asked if Richard had ever been violent towards Barbara, and Barbara had relayed one story that Richard had pulled a dagger on her and said he was going to stab her.
This was not the only alarming story Barbara's roommates relayed to detectives.
About a month before Barbara was murdered, she reported that her gun was missing, and that raises all kinds of concerns. She reported it to campus police, and then, to my knowledge, she never got that gun back. A .357 revolver would have fit with the potential murder weapon that killed Barbara. She had expressed concern to her roommates that the person that had taken the gun may use that gun on her, and the roommates just kind of dismissed it. But now that Barbara was found shot to death, the roommates were concerned for themselves as well. Having that information, the investigators really wanted to find out who Richard was. At this point, all we have is Richard's first name. He's willing to maybe take a dagger and stab her.
We strongly felt that he could have been responsible for her murder.
Three days have passed since student Barbara Rocky was discovered shot dead in Big Cottonwood Canyon. And police are hunting a man named Richard, who they believe is her boyfriend.
This could be the person that killed Barbara, but all we have is Richard's first name, and so we're kind of running into a dead end.
With no way to identify their potential prime suspect, detectives catch a lucky break.
Out of the blue, a guy named Richard Finder calls into our department and tells us that he knew Barbara Rocky.
Richard Finder initiated contact, offering his services to basically try to help them solve this case.
First question we had was, is this the Richard that we've been looking for?
As investigators prepare to meet with Richard Finder, they learn everything they can about him.
We find out that he's in his 30s, and he's a self-proclaimed psychic. He lived in California. Barbara was from California, so that was one of the connections that they had. We also found out that a .357 pistol was registered to him, which is obviously the same caliber that we're looking for.
Richard Finder arrives at the sheriff's office, and detectives begin by asking him about his relationship with the 22-year-old college student.
Barbara heard Richard Finder on the radio talking about the occult. Barbara had called into the radio station. They ended up exchanging phone numbers. Barbara had gone up to see him at his hotel, and I think Barbara at one point even felt that Richard was her boyfriend. Richard claimed that it was just a spiritual relationship, that he looked at Barbara not in a physical way.
Under further questioning, Richard mentions something that gets the detectives' attention.
The place that he was staying at was very close to the mouth of the canyon where it was that Barbara Jean was found.
Detectives cut to the chase and ask Richard where he was on March 11th, the day that Barbara was killed.
He tells them that he was in Salt Lake at the time of the murder. He said that he had gotten up and had some breakfast, and then he went over and helped a friend do some construction work on a house all day long, and then he went back home and went to sleep on the couch.
Detectives set to work checking out Richard's alibi.
The guy that Richard Finder was staying with did confirm that Richard was with him in the evening, but he could not confirm the times that Richard told us about during the daytime.
With holes in Richard's alibi, detectives dig deeper into his claims about his relationship with Barbara.
Our investigators talked to Barbara's therapist, and she just really got the impression that Barbara was in love with Richard.
The therapist reveals another way the relationship was less innocent than Richard made it seem.
Barbara described Richard as a great warlock and maybe even a devil worshiper.
I think that the satanic and the witchcraft, it's not too far-fetched to think, okay, somebody took her up there into the woods. This was potentially a sacrifice.
When police confront Richard with these allegations, his response is even more alarming.
He's telling us that he's having these dreams and that she was shot in the back in a triangular pattern, and that's a sign of a possible Satan killing or devil worship. Richard also told us that he had a vision that the murder weapon was also thrown into water. How would he know that we didn't have the murder weapon? So that really raised a question to us. We're wondering, is this guy confessing to us? Is he telling us about our crime scene? He has all of this knowledge. Is this guy the one that killed Barbara that day?
When you start putting all of these things together, it made Richard Finder a pretty good suspect.
Despite the circumstantial evidence stacking up against him, detectives need something more concrete.
So we collect all of his weapons for ballistic tests with the projectiles that we located from Barbara's body. We received the results from the ballistics test, and they were not a match. And that pretty much blew up most of our case with Richard Finder.
Detectives pin their hopes on the results of the handwriting analysis on the note found in Barbara's vehicle.
Maybe she wrote the note under duress. Maybe she was forced to write the note.
That could be a significant clue, especially if it's determined that our victim didn't author the note. It's like someone's writing a suicide note for someone else.
The handwriting analysis came back and it showed that Barbara was the one that had written the note.
The letter itself seemed to be a valid letter to her friends, and several people said that's Barbara's handwriting.
The investigators concluded that maybe Barbara was thinking about moving home, and she was just explaining that in the note. At this point, we're starting to run out of leads.
As the investigation stalls, Barbara's family is rocked by another tragedy.
My dad would call the police practically every day when nothing was coming to fruition. And he died like within a year after she died.
It killed my father. And we had so many key relatives die, still wanting to know what happened to Barbara.
Detectives never give up on the case, and a year later, in 1975, they notice a disturbing pattern of crimes.
There's women all over the American West that are going missing and being discovered dead.
College co-eds with dark hair were found murdered, and the serial killer was certainly the big topic of conversation.
A surprising arrest changes the whole course of the investigation.
In 1975, a Utah State trooper makes an arrest west of Salt Lake City.
The suspect was arrested for a kidnapping case, and some of the evidence in the vehicle definitely could have had something to do with Barbara's murder as well.
The driver's name is Ted Bundy.
This guy turns out to be probably the most famous, notorious serial killer of all time. Is he the one that killed Barbara?
A year and a half after the murder of Barbara Rockey, The investigation is sparked back into life by the arrest of notorious serial killer Ted Bundy.
More and more that police start investigating Ted Bundy, the more connections they find to missing and murdered women all over the country.
In 1974, Ted Bundy was also in the Utah area, going to school at the University of Utah.
Barbara Jean fit Ted Bundy's profile.
She was a college student. She was a brunette, and she was the age that Ted Bundy seemed to target.
Ted Bundy had a reputation of being a very charming man. You know, he was a good-looking guy and was kind of a smooth talker.
Ted Bundy would act like he was hurt and ask for some assistance from a female, and that would have fit right with the personality of Barbara. She would have helped Ted Bundy if he had approached her.
With Barbara fitting the profile of Bundy's victims, detectives connect with the FBI.
The investigators were able to get a hold of a timeline that the FBI had prepared, find out what his whereabouts were on March 11, 1974. When the investigators looked at Ted Bundy's timeline, they found that he had an ironclad alibi for that day because he was in Washington committing another murder.
With Bundy cleared, the Barbara Rocky investigation grinds to a halt.
The investigators had done everything forensically that they could. They had done all the interviews that they could. They had looked at all the suspects that they could, and the case just went cold.
Once the case was cold, we pretty much accepted that it was not going to be solved.
When a case goes cold, it definitely affects the family every bit as much, if not more, than the investigator. They just want someone to be held accountable for their daughter's death.
The case lies unsolved for 30 years, while Barbara's family yearns for answers.
The hope and the drive to crack this case someday was powered by losing so many family members that were enraged and wanted justice. So we had nothing to lose by trying.
In 2005, Barbara's loved ones make one last push for justice.
I asked Mom, I said, do you want me to try to open this? And she said yes, because I need to know before I die.
I was a fairly new homicide detective, and my phone rang, and it was one of the family members saying, hey, my sister was killed back in 1974. Our mom's getting up in years, and she'd really like to know who killed her daughter.
The family would expect us to just do what needs to be done to solve their case, and you can't put a price tag on this level of justice.
Digging into the 30-year-old case files, detectives' attention is drawn to one suspect in particular, the self-proclaimed psychic, Richard Finder.
I was not convinced that law enforcement had closed the door all the way on Richard Finder.
I wanted to look into Richard further because the timeline to me wasn't rock solid, and I wanted to try to look more into the forensic end of it. DNA and the ballistic stuff has come a long ways since 1974. As I'm looking through each piece of evidence, I'm trying to figure out if that would have any forensic benefit to having tested.
While evidence from the original crime scene is sent to the crime lab, investigators dig deeper into Richard's version of events.
As I started looking at Richard's alibi, I spoke with some of the same people that the investigators had spoke with previously.
As we reinvestigated and re-interviewed these people, information that wasn't known back then was revealed.
What I learned was that Richard had been dating and seeing a friend of Barbara's, Janelle. But then Barbara also found that Janelle was getting closer to Richard Finder than Barbara was, and there was some animosity from what I understand regarding that.
I learned that sometime very close to the murder, Richard had left town with Janelle Bach, and Richard and Janelle became boyfriend and girlfriend, and that was kind of a blow to Barbara. That really kind of stuck out to me.
Janelle came back to Salt Lake for 3 or 4 days around the time of the homicide with Richard Finder, and they were staying at a house just west of the mouth of the canyon. where Barbara was found.
Had Barbara confronted Richard about Janelle only for the encounter to turn fatal?
Because of this relationship between Janelle and Barbara, and because Richard Finder supposedly had guns, and then because of his witchcraft and the possibility of human sacrifice, Richard Finder was up there on the list as a potential suspect.
Investigators try to bring Richard in for another interview.
Unfortunately, we found that Richard Finder had passed away.
So really, the only avenue I had was to go talk with Janelle.
Was Janelle the only living person who knew what really happened to Barbara?
I didn't see any information in the case file where Janelle Bach had really given a good interview about Richard Finder, and so that was the place that I wanted to start.
Barbara was upset that Janelle had essentially taken Richard Finder. So when they came back, there's this potential triangle and some jealousy. It placed some suspicion on Janelle.
Anytime an investigation reveals some sort of a love triangle, that can easily turn deadly when there's jealousy involved, and all of a sudden, the whole thing shifts from one guy to the person that's least suspected.
3 decades after Barbara Rockey was found murdered in a Utah canyon, cold case detectives want to speak to Barbara's former roommate, Janelle, who had been dating Richard Finder, the psychic Barbara had fallen in love with.
Janelle was looked at because of this triangle and this dispute, and Richard Finder was aware that there was this jealousy.
Detectives want to know if either Richard or Janelle had the opportunity to kill Barbara.
They were back in Salt Lake for 3 or 4 days on a ski trip during the time of Barbara's demise, but they never went skiing. And they were staying at a place that was close to the crime scene where Barbara was found.
Janelle was able to give me a timeline that she was with Richard that day, and the hours that she wasn't coincided with the times from the initial investigation.
It was confirmed with others that she was very sick when she came up here. She didn't even leave the house, and she was being taken care of by Richard Finder during the time of the homicide and was not in that area.
Janelle Bach was able to give me enough information to make me feel that he definitely was not the killer of Barbara, and she was not a suspect any longer.
Undeterred, detectives scour through the files from 1974, looking for details the original investigators may have missed.
As I was going through the case file, Jerry Hicker's name kept popping up.
So Jerry's early role in the case was he was one of the last people to allegedly have seen Barbara Jean at about 10 o'clock in the morning.
He reported her missing, so he really wasn't somebody that they were looking at as having a role in her death.
They were really good friends. That came through in the investigation, but I wasn't satisfied about him not being a suspect.
Detectives reach out to Barbara's former roommates, asking them about Jerry.
Some of the roommates told me that, Jerry just didn't have a lot of friends, and Barbara was accepting of everybody. Jerry just kind of latched on to Barbara, and I think Jerry had more romantic feelings for Barbara than Barbara did for him.
I think that the roommates kind of looked at Jerry as basically kind of a stray pet that people were taking care of.
He just didn't seem like somebody who would kill somebody.
When investigators dig into Jerry's life after Barbara's murder, they make a disturbing discovery.
Jerry had been accused of rape in the Provo area after Barbara's murder.
When I found that Jerry was arrested for a sexual assault, I want to know, could Jerry have been the one that killed Barbara? Barbara's roommate had been away from Jerry for a long time. In the interviews, I found out that Jerry really had an obsession with guns, and that he helped Barbara find the .357 that she bought. He took her out, showed her how to shoot the .357.
Jerry would always tell Barbara about how to load her firearm, leaving one of the cylinders in the revolver empty, and then looking back and seeing that Barbara was shot 5 times. Is that relevant in this case?
We actually looked at the Emmy's report, and we couldn't really determine if she had been shot 5 or 6 times. There was the opinion that it was 6, but it could have also been, through the re-entries and fragments, could have been 5.
As I'm going through these interviews and I'm listening to what the roommates are telling me, he was a rock-solid suspect at this point.
Detectives race to track down Jerry Hicker.
I went to Jerry Hicker's house in Washington. I explained to him that I was looking at the Barbara Rocky case. Jerry immediately said, you'll have to talk with my attorney, and that he wasn't going to give me a statement. So at that point, I had nothing else to do but leave.
With Jerry refusing to cooperate, investigators must find concrete evidence to link him to Barbara's murder.
We wanted to see if, with today's technology, that if there was a sexual assault, that there might be something suitable for DNA testing.
I was pretty excited to find that a vaginal and rectal swab had been taken on Barbara, because by now we were utilizing DNA testing, and I thought that I was going to be able to match those up with DNA that we got from whatever suspects were in the case file.
Investigators hope that the swab test results will point toward Jerry.
They didn't know about DNA in 1974, and they packaged everything in plastic. Because it was packaged in plastic, it ruined any DNA that was in any of the biological material that was taken. I was devastated. I thought I was going to be able to solve that case really quickly, but that's not what happened.
Fearing that the case will go cold again without solid evidence, investigators gamble on another way to obtain the evidence they're looking for.
I took items that had not been tested yet from the original evidence to our crime lab to have them tested.
The original crime scene evidence includes a soil sample from beneath Barbara's body.
I was just more or less taking the dirt out to have a sample taken in case some seminal fluid had migrated down into the dirt.
There was still the belief, based on the scene and everything, that there was a possibility of a sexual assault.
When I got the results of the test, surprisingly, we got a match that there was DNA from the soil that was underneath Barbara's body.
After 30 years, had DNA analysis finally identified Barbara's killer?
And what came back as a result of that testing was shocking.
It's been 33 years since student Barbara Rocky was found stripped and shot in Big Cottonwood Canyon, Utah. In 2007, DNA in a soil sample from under her body finally reveals her killer.
Finding that DNA in the soil was like finding a needle in a haystack, a big haystack.
The results come in. got a match, and it's Jerry Hicker.
Just that little bit of information was all that we needed to link Jerry Hicker to this crime scene. He was not who we suspected initially. And so to learn that he was the one responsible for killing her was very surprising.
On November 6th, 2007, 56-year-old Jerry Hicker is charged with the first-degree murder of Barbara Rocky.
When I first found out that the killer of Barbara was Jerry Hicker, I was surprised because I heard that he was just sort of a guy from next door.
It was a shock. I never thought it would be solved.
As prosecutors prepare for their day in court, they piece together a theory of how Jerry killed Barbara.
So our belief of what happened was Jerry Hicker knew that Barbara may be leaving because that next morning, and he was aware of the letter before he brought the car back.
I think what tipped him over the edge was he wanted Barbara sexually, and her rejection and her indication of leaving Jerry was more than he could take.
Hicker winds up talking Rocky into going up Big Cottonwood Canyon with this scenic view one more time before she leaves.
And when they get to this spot, Jerry's trying to put the moves on Barbara, and she doesn't want to have anything to do with Jerry that way.
Hicker takes out a gun, and in rage, he tells her to strip down, and she was probably folding the clothes in order to buy herself a little more time.
Barbara's pleading for her life. She's just trying to get anything into Jerry's mind to not do this.
And then he shot her, apparently while she was standing up. And then she went down, and then he shot her 4 times in the lower back region.
After the murder, Jerry tried to cover his tracks.
Jerry has to drive back to campus. He gets rid of the gun, and he's trying to come up with alibis. He knows he can't park the car right there at Barbara's house, so he takes it over to the Parkway Plaza apartments, and that's where he decides he's going to use this letter making her a missing person.
This was a young woman who trusted somebody. They're supposed to be going to a nice spot, and instead she's shot and murdered.
I felt so horrible knowing that she had gone through something like that. She was probably so scared. Nobody deserved to die like that. Nobody.
I believe that Jerry was being the concerned, loving friend, and that may have put some thoughts in the investigator's mind that there's just no way Jerry could have done this.
Beneath his facade just seemed to be rage and anger that he'd been rejected.
I think Jerry Hicker was a sexual predator. They got away with a lot of crimes.
We were so glad and so grateful that the detectives had worked so hard. It boggled my mind that they could solve it after 34 years.
Despite an airtight case against Jerry, his declining health leaves prosecutors with a new dilemma.
When I went to arrest Jerry, he had been diagnosed with cancer. He was just the shell of a man. We didn't feel that his lifespan was much of 5 years, if that.
So we worked out a deal that he would plead to a substantially reduced charge of manslaughter, and that he would be sentenced to the prison for 5 years, figuring that that would be a life sentence.
Going with the plea deal was my mom's decision. She wanted him to say in his own words that he did it. She wanted those answers.
Jerry Hicker serves 3 years in Utah State Prison, and in 2014, 5 years after pleading guilty, he dies of cancer.
I bet you he had been looking over his shoulders all these years. I felt that his ill health was Barbara's justice.
This is somebody that wasted away not only his life, he ruined so many people's lives by his selfish act. Barbara didn't deserve this. She had so much ahead of her, but the family does have some answers. That's the goal in my investigation.
I think that in this case, justice was served and that the family got answers that they would not have otherwise had.
The thing I miss most about Barbara was the times that we used to blast Beatles music and sing and dance for hours and just being kids, you know? I remember her then.
Barbara was such a giving person. I feel inspired by her ability to give of herself. And I try to emulate that.
From the 9-1, switch that over, that's the young blonde. I was at the West Coast, now I'm in the East Coast. Shawty wanna